friend.
Hello,
Pat Corcoran, Vice President of the Friends of Mount Hope Cemetery. She's going to introduce our speaker.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Pat Corcoran, and it is an honor for me to welcome Dr. Leigh, Associate Professor of History at Moyne College in Syracuse. She received her PhD from the University of Houston and her Master of Science, Library Science from Simmons College in Boston. Leigh is the author, as you all know now, of the book Women in the World of Frederick Douglass, for which she won the 2018 Herbert Lehman Award for Scholarship in New York History. She also served as Associate Editor for the first volume of Frederick Douglass Papers, published by Yale University in 2009. Now, Leigh, we know that last year was a special year for Frederick Douglass, but you know that in Rochester, every year is the year of Frederick Douglass. And we are all honored that the final resting place of Frederick Douglass, many of his family members, and many of his associates, their final resting place is Mount Hope Cemetery. You will not find a more enthusiastic audience for your years of research than the Friends of Mount Hope Cemetery, and we welcome you to our annual meeting.
Get all set up here. Sorry, I don't need to. All right. I'll try not to go off on too many tangents. That seems to be my forte. I could go on a nice long-winded introduction, but we'll be here all night because then I go off book and it goes on and on and on. But I just want to thank you all so much. I want to thank Pat for inviting me. This is, you all take care of Frederick Douglass. I mean, you literally take care of Frederick Douglass. And I have to say, today is 7 months ago today, my father died. And, you know, and I'm learning to live with it now. But, yeah, I always loved cemeteries. But as I was telling Rose earlier, I've always loved cemeteries. And you know, they're just nice to go to, and something as beautiful as Mount Hope. But I really now appreciate their function more than I had ever before. And my father was cremated, and he and my mother will, when she passes on, will be cremated, and their ashes will be mixed together, and then they'll be, you all will probably be subpoenaed on this one day. Their ashes, they want their ashes sprinkled over Tiger Stadium, and which I believe is illegal, but my brothers and I have committed to it. And so if you get subpoenaed one day, this is one. So anyway, but no, I really, honestly, I appreciate all the work you do to take care of Frederick Douglass, to take care of the two women here, Helen and Anna, and little Annie, and Rosetta and her family, and the Posts, and Porters, and Susan DeAnthony, and just everybody else out there, because somebody out there loved them, and you know, they deserve their rest, and you all take care of them. So it's beautiful. So thank you. So now for today, what I was going to do is usually people want me to give the typical book talk, but I like to give a little twist, especially when there's something to connect to the place. And so I wanted to give a talk today that includes Mount Hope Cemetery and the site. And so what I wanted to do is, and I want to make sure that I get this correctly. So let's begin at the ending, at the gravesite of Frederick Douglass. Here, I took this picture, I think mine when I first visited here. Here, the great man himself lies at the center, covered in the plain slab. It's adorned only with his name and his dates and raised bond letters. I'm not telling you all anything new that you don't see every other day. And to his right lies a smaller slab, marking the remains of his second wife, Helen, widow of orator and statesman Frederick Douglass. It reads with Frederick's name carved in letters as large as her own. It's much wordier than her husband's, and the inscription explains that through provision, his greatness was memorialized at Cedar Hill in Washington, D.C. And that will figure into this as well. Now, above Frederick rises the other monument. This monument, its style and its position is all at odds with the other two slabs. The name Douglas dominates the base, and to the memory of Frederick Douglass appears on the side facing his grave. Again, you all are very familiar with this. Unless you wonder who wanted that memory preserved, the words erected by his son, Lewis H. and Charles R. remind you. The brothers also honored their little sister Annie, who had died at age 10, a week short of her 11th birthday, in 1860, and was later buried in this place. But more importantly, they commemorated their mother, Anna, wife of Frederick Douglass. And when I first started this book, I didn't realize, it does tell an interesting tale anyway, looking at it without knowing other things about it. But the gravesite forms this set piece that tells a tale, and actually a struggle, over the way that Frederick Douglass and his life and work should be remembered. And that's the subject of my talk today. Now, the struggle over this particular site came to Helen Douglass's attention in 1898. Okay. I forgot I had animation. Okay. Sometimes I get really excited about the animation. Okay, there we go. Woo-hoo. Okay, there we go. The struggle over this particular site came to Helen Douglass's attention in 1898, 3 years after Frederick's death. She received this letter from David Z. Morris, the superintendent of Mount Hope Cemetery at the time, informing her that not only were Charles and Lewis having that family monument erected over Frederick's grave, but that the lot also had another occupant, that is other than Annie or Frederick. Morris wrote, "The first wife of Mr. Douglass was moved here during last spring and interred on the lot between Mr. Douglass and the child's grave, I believe by order of the sons." Clearly, this was news to Helen. As far as she knew, Anna had been buried in Graceland Cemetery in Washington, D.C. after her death in 1882. And Helen herself had just gone through quite a bit of trouble and expense to have Frederick's slab placed over his grave during the previous spring. Now, she had envisioned a gravesite that contained Frederick's remains, and of course little Annie's, Frederick's remains with her own eventually at his side. Lewis and Charles, on the other hand, seemed to have envisioned a family plot that contained the bodies of their father, mother, and little sister with a single monument in tribute to them all. And neither Helen nor the sons seem to have consulted one another about their plans. Now, Morris's news put a kink into this larger project of Helen's to turn Cedar Hill and the Douglass property in Anacostia, D.C. into a monument to Frederick's life and work. Now, part of that proposal at the time included the removal of Frederick's body to the Cedar Hill property, presumably with the slab, since she had gone through so much expense to get it done. She had hoped to be buried at his side when her own time came, all there on the property. So what would happen is you'd go there and see them. The Douglass children strenuously objected to this on the grounds that Rochester was a more proper place for their father's burial. I mean, after all, this is really next door to where they lived. Furthermore, the process of digging up Frederick's remains would unduly desecrate the grave of Anna, who was not covered in any vision for the future of Cedar Hill because, well, they thought she was buried across the river from Cedar Hill. So this again was all news to Helen. Now, the caretakers of Mount Hope Cemetery agreed about the desecration of the grave, and eventually Washington, D.C. city ordinances against burials on private property prevented the scheme from coming to fruition. Helen, meanwhile, continued with the rest of the plans for the memorial without Frederick's body. She founded the Frederick Douglass Memorial and Historical Association with the help of the leading African Americans in Washington, and that organization ultimately took control of Cedar Hill after her death. She willed the whole property and building and its contents to them. And then when she died, she was brought up here and buried by her husband's side. And she had actually been really worried once she found out about the monument, and she couldn't move Frederick's body, and she was really afraid that when she died, she wouldn't be buried by his side, like she would be barred from being buried by his side. But Morris assured her, no, you have complete, full legal right to be buried by his side. So she's okay. She loved him. And another little bit of the story, in Honeoye, where she's from, there's actually a marker to her and the Pitts family plot. So they wanted her buried there. So these restless bodies of the dead, which are ghoulish in the way of Victorians, opened this unexpected chapter, because I just imagined as I came across this, they were gonna dig up his body. They dug up her body and they moved it. Okay, just let's not go down that thought road. Let's just get back. So, this opened up this unexpected chapter that honestly had no idea was going to even be there when I first conceived of the book. And so, because since the moment of his passing, the public had claimed Douglas's memory, and as with most prominent figures, his widow and family felt the responsibility of calibrating his image in his death. With Douglas, however, the widow and the children pursued divergent narratives about the historical meaning of his life. And the difference that caused those narratives to diverge gained increasing importance in a period of time in which white reconciliation narratives had marginalized African Americans in the history of the preceding centuries, specifically the Civil War and the causes of the Civil War. And the point over which the Douglas narrative separated was the function that these wives would play, both as symbols and agents in the commemoration of his life and his work. So let's turn to those wives and those marriages and start with Anna. Okay, let's see, there we go. Now, Anna's funeral in 1882 was reported to have been a massive affair. It's shocking how large this was for a woman who herself was so private. Her body was surrounded by flowers at Cedar Hill, which had been her home for, when you think about it, only 4 years. She was attended by her husband, her 4 children, their spouses, 15 grandchildren, who were the survivors of a total of 21. And according to one newspaper, 3,000 people waited outside, and nearly 100 carriages accompanied her body across the Anacostia River to her burial at Graceland Cemetery. I sometimes think maybe she would have been a little embarrassed by that, but it showed her respect. Commentators across the country hailed her as a woman who was a crown to her husband, as a worthier woman never lived. And the reason that the home life of Mr. Douglas, so pure and dignified, is above all praise. In his eulogy, Bishop T.M.D. Ward retold the story from her husband's autobiographies about their wedding, but added his own embellishments. He insisted that since that time they had lived happily together as man and wife, that Frederick had a wife that was to him more than the term ordinarily implies, that she was to him the object of the most tender affection, for whose feelings and opinions he always entertained the most profoundest respect, and he was to her a hero, an ideal husband. Okay, well, yes, no, Anna was the actual Anna was, as her daughter Rosetta put it, someone who could not be known all at once. She had to be studied. The praise at her funeral betrayed little knowledge of the woman herself, fitting a few facts of her life into this pre-existing narrative of a dutiful, supportive wife, true womanhood in the terms of the time. And of course, this was appropriate to the time and the occasion. A full, honest depiction of Anna was not the point of a public funeral, and ultimately irrelevant to the symbolism of her life at the side of her husband. And this kind of what they said in private is another thing. A more poignant assessment came in private letters. Frederick's longtime comrade against racial oppression, Henry O. Wagner, expressed his sympathy over Anna's death, writing that it was especially sad to you because she was a choice of your youth. A phrase that was repeated in many later public assessments of Frederick's marital choices. Yet, as one Washington lady decried, was it nothing to have been the choice of such a youth? Well, Wagner didn't mean, as some other people did, to apply any kind of folly with his phrasing, but rather the cognizance of the life that the newly married Frederick and Anna had sought, and the obstacles that they faced in 1838 when Frederick, as he himself put it, I shouldered one part of my baggage, Anna took up the other, and they began their lives together, which I think is a really key passage in his narratives. Now, had they stayed in Baltimore, he a slave, she a free black woman, fending for herself as a live-in domestic, well, they had no guarantees that they could keep their family together. In an age of increasing slave sales from the Chesapeake to New Orleans, he describes Austin Wolfbolt marching those slave coffles down to Fells Point, right at the end of the street where he lived. They could expect the opposite. Even in freedom, especially as Frederick's career as an orator and editor placed him before a very critical public, their ability to just simply raise a bourgeois, educated, intact family was constantly in question. I mean, ask William Lloyd Garrison and his attacks he made on that family, and that was the Allies. Their mission was to prove racial stereotypes wrong and to seize the right to protect that family, to raise that family, to educate that family. Together, they demanded industry, discipline, and achievement from their children, and according to their daughter Rosetta, both were rigid as to the matter of obedience. Behave. Now, behind this facade, of course, lay disputes. I mean, 44 years, and from everything I can tell, everyone in the Douglas family were people of strong opinions. So, including Anna. But Anna was as powerful a personality inside her home as her husband was outside. And she took great pride in this household because it was something that she would never have expected from her life in Baltimore in her youth. I mean, this was her home. Her home. Not somebody else's, her kids. Not somebody else's. And with her husband gone so frequently and for so long, it was her domain. Yet she didn't self-sacrificingly shoulder the household management, and occasionally she vented her frustrations on her long-absent husband. He may have been, in Rosetta's words, mother's honored guest when he first returned from a tour. But as he himself confessed, by the time I am home a week or two longer, I shall pretty fully learn how many points there is in need of improvement in my temper and disposition as a husband and a father. Nevertheless, all of the family understood that these matters remained in the home, among the family members. You don't tell your business, you know? With a few exceptions, they erected an impenetrable barrier between themselves and intrusive eyes. As a successful black family, they ensured an image that served a higher purpose and a greater movement. Even with the matriarch of this family gone, that image and its purpose could persist, and the tributes at her funeral helped bulwark this presentation. Now, she died in 1882. An image is great, but an image don't keep a man warm at night. Okay. At 64, although Rosetta, when asked would her father remarried, Rosetta said, well, I thought he was beyond all of that stuff. Like 64, really? So, at 64, Frederick had spent over half of his life relying on a close companion and was still a man of great vitality. I mean, like 5 years later, the man climbs the pyramids. A year and a half after Anna died, that's 17 months and 20 days, he remarried. Now, the speed of remarriage did not shock people because, you know, men didn't stay in widowhoods long in those days, but the bride did. Helen Pitts had worked as a copyist for Frederick's Recorder of Deeds office since 1882. This is often, she's referred to as his secretary, but that's not really true. I mean, it kind of gives you the image of the old 1950s, marrying a secretary and little chippy and that kind of a thing. Not that but in those days, you didn't have copy machines, and in a Recorder of Deeds office, you need a bunch of copies. So women with nice handwriting became the Xerox machine of the 19th century. So, and that's what she did. So, she had worked as a copyist in his Recorder of Deeds office since 1882, and the Pitts and Douglas families had crossed each other's paths for at least 3 decades. The Pitts had come from Honeoye, New York, and had supported abolition since the 1840s, and contrary to newspaper reports, the Pitts were not of the lowest sort. They had sent all of their children to college. Helen and her sister Jane, who was really her closest friend, had graduated from Mount Holyoke in 1859, and their younger sister Eva was among the first women to attend Cornell and receive a master's degree in the 1870s. And Helen taught school sporadically for about 2 decades, including, and this was the most awesome thing I found, a year at a freedman school in Norfolk, Virginia. One of the first ones to go down there, basically at ground zero of emancipation. Yeah. And no, really, when I found that out, I was like, okay, there's the attraction. And read the book about this, because I was just like, oh. Okay, that's another paper. Okay, so anyway, she also served as a corresponding secretary for the Moral Education Society in Washington, D.C. in 1877, and she was not, as you would have her believe, you know, they give this image of, you know, this old man and this young woman, you know, and like, no, she was 46. Okay, so she was 46 at the time of their marriage, and well, okay, that did put her a year older than Rosetta, who was incidentally her supervisor at the Recorder of Deeds office. Well, I mean, to be fair, Douglas employed everybody, and he employed a lot of women in the Recorder of Deeds office. So, like, all of his kids at some point worked in the Recorder of Deeds office, and some of his granddaughters. She was 2 decades younger than. Newspaper reports, however, like to exaggerate the difference in their age. They like to say he was, you know, as high as 75, while she was as young as 33, which I know that's like, oh, 75, yeah, but 33. But you know, they were trying to exaggerate that he was, to give that image of this old, creepy man marrying this young, fresh woman. But, of course, what really most people could not get over was her race. She was white. Okay, and people still have a hard time getting over that. And this was right here. This was an advertisement. It says, the newsboy says, "Hiya there, Jenny. Who's those folks with sulfur bitters?" And the bootblack says, "I expect that's Fred Douglas and his wife. Golly, he's going to take the sulfur bitters for his complexion." He's trying to lighten his complexion. Okay, so and this marriage, I mean, it causes this uproar among both blacks and whites in both families. In regard to Douglas's public image, however, the fact of Helen's whiteness upended really neat depictions of Frederick as representative of his race. Black heroes do not symbolically reject their blackness by passing over African American women eligible, because there were lots of really, you know, in fact, the minister who married them, Francis Grimke, thought when he said, "I'm going to get married," thought it was going to be, as he put it, one of the lovely, the eligible colored ladies of the race. But, you know, black heroes don't pass over eligible African-American women to choose a white wife. Okay. In Washington, D.C., a prominent colored citizen who has been on intimate terms with Mr. Douglas, as he was described in the newspaper, but who also wished to remain anonymous, insisted that the marriage would certainly dethrone Douglas from the high position he occupied with his own race. In Atlanta, Colonel W.A. Pledger, chairman of the National Colored Executive Committee and president of the National Colored Press Association, told reporters that as a leader of the colored people, his course has been impolitic and destroys his usefulness for their good. A commentator in the Washington Post proclaimed the feeling among eligible females of a marriageable middle age was that Frederick had committed an uncalled for affront and did himself lasting discredit in going outside of his own people to ally himself with white trash. And they did use that term. Ultimately, this writer concluded, whatever Mr. Douglas may have gained as a husband, he has lost his grip as a political Moses. Frederick responded to this criticism much as he did when anyone pried into his personal affairs. I don't see why there should be any comment, he told the reporter. You know, but so long as he had the reporter's ear, he elaborated on his reasons. I have simply exercised the right which the laws accord every citizen, he said. And as for his role as a leader, he added, what effects can the affairs of my private life have upon my principles of justice? I want for the colored people equal rights and advantages of citizenship, and for those objects I am still working just as earnestly. The thrust of this argument, however, aimed at the underlying hypocrisy of those who opposed interracial marriage. All this excitement, then, is caused by my marriage with a woman a few shades lighter than myself, he pointed out. If I had married a black woman, there would have been nothing said about it. Yet the disparity in complexions would have been the same. And indeed, decades earlier, people had made comments about Anna's color, and she was dark-skinned, that had implied that her darkness had made her not quite good enough for the lighter Frederick. And indeed, when Frederica Bremer, the writer, had visited here in Rochester, all she said about Anna, I mean, she goes on and describes Douglas as, you know, almost Arab, you know, very exotic, and then she describes everybody in that, and then she goes, and his wife is completely black. So just as Frederick had used the integrity of his family as part of this assault on limitations placed upon his race, he also highlighted the arbitrary nature of those limitations by crossing or emphasizing lines of segregation. He routinely took a seat in white train cars. In fact, he got thrown off with the seats in New England. And he sat in the ladies' gallery of the state legislatures when he was barred from the men's because he was black. His public appearances with white women, which caused so much scandal, even within the abolitionist movement, served the same purpose. I do not believe in isolation. I do not believe in emigration, but I do believe in amalgamation, the assimilations of the races, he remarked in 1883. And I tell you, fellow citizens, that the power that rocks the cradle of civilization today is amalgamated power. And he held up his own person as an example, always emphasizing his African ancestry, but pointing to his mixed parentage as evidence of the reality that racial mixing was already very much part of America's history. By extension, equality would come not at the expense of black history or experience, but because of it, and include people of African descent in both the polity, but also in the concept of an American nation. As his sympathetic contemporaries noted, his marriage to a white woman, and I think I have it, let's move this picture off. Can't get it. This is a very sensitive, there we go. Going to Niagara Falls for your honeymoon. when was that not a cliche? Okay. Now, as his sympathetic contemporaries noted, his marriage to a white woman was entirely in keeping with his political activism. The same was true of Helen. From her upbringing in an abolitionist household, to her year at the Freedmen's School in Norfolk, Virginia, which left her debilitated and ill, to her defense of black women's participation in suffrage organizations, to her speeches against the convict lease system, she consistently identified herself as an ally of black civil rights. As one of her former classmates at Mount Holyoke observed, by marrying Douglas, Helen was putting her ideals into practice. When you read older biographies, it's always like, well, you know, of course she married Douglas, you know, but there's more to it than that, because she gave up a lot of her privilege to marry him. Yet the Douglases' point was too dangerous an argument to make, both in 1884 and especially for most African Americans. Indeed, many of Frederick's associates who supported them were men much like himself, children of mixed-race liaisons, and I don't quite know what word to use there, so I'm using liaisons, because the mixed race, the racial mixing is, especially since most of these men, their mothers were slaves, the question of consent is absent. Partners in mixed-race marriages, living either in Washington, D.C. or northern cities, and very middle class or elite. The majority of black Americans lived very, very different lives. And less than a decade later, the Douglases' friend, the Ida B. Wells, who herself, you know, she said, I was really disappointed when he married a white woman, but then he met them and she became friends with them, began her investigations into the strange fruit of the South, many of whom met their fates from the mere rumor of interracial sex. So by 1884, Southern states had retrenched a racial caste system that, among other horrors, led generations of Southern black children to internalize their inferior status, or their alleged inferior status, something that was very painfully demonstrated by Kenneth and Mamie Clark 60 years later with their doll experiment. And if you can go online, a young woman redid the experiment about a decade ago and found she got the same results. Cleveland editorialist Africanus came closest to naming the crime Frederick had committed when he wrote, "It is now said that the highest ambition of the Negro is to marry white, and this, Mr. Douglas, I am sorry to say, proves by his recent marriage." Many people believe that a man of Douglas's stature had a responsibility to other struggling African Americans to demonstrate that he valued his race by marrying within it. Now, Frederick and his supporters insisted that his marriage to Helen remain a personal matter. But even in private, they confronted painful opposition. With the exception of her sister Jenny, and eventually her mother, and to a lesser degree her sister Eva, Helen's family shunned the Douglas couple. Her father cut her out of his will, and her sister Lorinda would never speak of Helen to her grandchildren. Frederick's family had a greater investment in their father's choice to remarry, and of them, the person who reacted most furiously was Louisa Sprague. And do you all know who Louisa Sprague is? Okay, Louisa Sprague was Rosetta's husband's little sister. Louisa had lived in the Douglas home since 1869 when she was approximately 9 years old. And over the decades, she had helped Anna manage the household and grew really from a foster daughter to a friend. And she stayed on after Anna died, running the home in her stead until Helen arrived. And as with the Douglas children, she may have felt the marriage was a betrayal of Anna, but she faced an entirely different living arrangement with a white mistress in the house, understanding she came from PG County, Prince George's County, and she came out of slavery. So this was a power dynamic that was too reminiscent of slavery or domestic service. She wasn't going to be a daughter. She was going to be, in her eyes, a servant. Louisa refused to accept Helen as a new lady of the house, and so she fled to Nathan and Rosetta. And then actually it's probably Nathan. But she sued Douglas for back wages as Cedar Hill's housekeeper. Okay. She and Douglas settled on their own rather than drag it through court. As for everyone else, as always, all parties maintained a public face of harmony, and in private, both children and grandchildren felt compelled to reiterate that Helen always welcomed them and treated them cordially. Little evidence exists to suggest open discord beyond Louisa's lawsuit, and at least initially, when the Spraggs and Douglases found themselves at odds, the source usually lay in Nathan Sprague's failings. But to be fair, as Rose has hypothesized, and I think it's a really great idea, he had served in the Massachusetts 54th, so he possibly, and he had been a slave, so he possibly was suffering from PTSD, and that's Rose's idea. Totally crediting you for that. So, friction within the family, lost my place. Friction within the family, however, materialized most immediately after Frederick's death on February 20th, 1895. At the funeral in Washington, Helen reportedly sat alone in a pew, separate from the Douglas children and grandchildren. A decade earlier, the children probably had anticipated that they would have to share an inheritance when their father brought home a new wife. And within a matter of weeks of the funeral, so auspicious an institution as the New York Times repeated rumors from Rochester that the children by Douglas's first wife claimed that their white stepmother unduly influenced their father and got his property. Both Helen and Douglas' sons Charles and Louis moved quickly to quash the rumors as tissues of falsehood and utterly false. Nevertheless, within days of the denial, Rosetta challenged the will on the grounds that it contained signatures of only 2 witnesses instead of the requisite 3. Louis joined Helen in her defense, but soon he too was at odds with her over the dower rights to bonds purchased after the will had been drawn. Helen's claims to property in Rochester and Washington produced similar lawsuits over the remainder of the decade, and the party had varying degrees of success, but all very much needed the income from the settlement of Douglas's will. For Helen, however, the key piece of the estate was the property at Cedar Hill. That was the one she had her eyes on, because she hoped to turn the site into a museum dedicated to Frederick and to the abolition movement. She received rights to the home for the remainder of her life, after which the house and its adjoining acreage, and when you go there today, what you see is only a fraction of what they own. They own a couple of blocks around it. And it would be sold and divided among the surviving heirs. So in order to secure full ownership to the property, she took out a mortgage to buy out the children. And that's the house up there. It's, so in some of the insides, that's actually probably not him. There's a bunch of pictures of him from the back. And for a man who'd like to get his picture taken, and they all date to this period of time. So it was probably a model. So they're taking pictures of like Douglas at work, Douglas getting on the carriage, and then they're selling them. So anyway, she took out a mortgage to buy the children's share, which led to an ongoing financial strain for herself and the subsequent owners, that is the Frederick Douglass Memorial and Historical Association, until it was paid off. And meanwhile, she set in motion an incorporation process that produced this Frederick Douglass Memorial and Historical Association and began raising funds. She sold a memorial booklet with these pictures in it to offer glimpses inside of Cedar Hill. Shouldn't it be preserved? Isn't this lovely? Subtly suggesting preservation and its costs. And when the National League of Colored Women held their annual meeting in Washington in 1896, these were the women you want to court. She courted them by inviting them on a pilgrimage up to the house. The list of attendees included many of the major women's figures in Black history of times, such as Anna Julia Cooper, Charlotte Fortin Grimke, and Mary Church Terrell. And really, if you wanted something done, you went to them. She also had the support of Ida B. Wells. Grimke and Terrell, along with their husbands, had long-standing friendships with Helen and Frederick, and they were very instrumental in bringing the League into the creation of the association. And then Helen shrewdly invited a Washington Post reporter to tour the house in 1897, And he would ask questions like, so, tell me, what was the color of your wedding dress? She'd say, oh, I don't remember, it was so long ago, and it was such an exciting day. And, oh, look, don't you think this is a lovely bust of Mr. Douglas? Look at her. This is where Mr. Douglas would write. But she led, or colluded with him, to conclude his article with an exchange in which the reporter affirmed her suggestion that Cedar Hill might make a wonderful memorial hall of the earliest efforts in the cause of freedom. And Helen said, well, do you think it's too soon of these ideas of mine to be known? Do you think it would hurt the object? But the reporter declared, Helen may be the one by which this mission to Douglas's people is carried out. And a year later, in August 1898, Senator Jacob Gallinger of New Hampshire proposed a bill to incorporate the Frederick Douglass Memorial and Historical Association. And the bill passed the Senate that year and in the House in 1900. Now, Helen continued to live at Cedar Hill, and she had several friends and boarders living there at the time, all women, and she bequeathed the property of the association after her death in 1903, and the National Park Service took it over in 1962 and retains control of it today. And at one point, all of his papers were in there as well, and so you'd go there to research the Frederick Douglass papers, which is cool. But then as the librarian in me thinks, oh crap, what was pardon my French. Actually, I say a few other words. But the security, God, what was the security procedures? Did documents walk off? I'm getting all, don't go down that train of thought. Okay, so anyway, Helen saw her efforts as following the model of the Mount Vernon Association in preserving the memory of George Washington, which was really the only example of a National Historic Preservation House museum at the time. And, she hoped to tell the story of freedom and justice, just as they hoped to do at Mount Vernon. But in place of the history of the American Revolution, led by George Washington, American freedom, she would use Cedar Hill to tell the story of the abolition movement, another story of American freedom, as led by Frederick Douglass. And Cedar Hill would proclaim a message of hope that, as she told the Washington Post reporter, every black man will be recognized as a man and every black woman as a woman in this land, and that colored people will be treated as people with souls. Remember, this is in the 1890s. Jim Crow is rising in the South. Ida B. Wells is publishing her exposés on lynching. Convict labor is in full force. Plessy versus Ferguson has been passed. That, however, this vision was not exactly the story that the Douglass children wanted told. And the problem lay in the storyteller, and thus the perspective she's bringing to this. Charles reacted most vociferously, publicly opposing the plans to create the association. Among his many objections, he caused the proposed interment of his father's body on the grounds of Cedar Hill, not only an insult to Mr. Douglas's children, but to the race at large. And he charged Helen with squandering his father's fortune and attempting to use the fundraising association for her own profit. And pointing to a passage in the Articles of Incorporation that commended Helen for her devotion and sacrifice, he demanded, what sacrifice has she made? Then he hit upon the family narrative that counters Helen's. My mother was colored. She was one of our people, he wrote. She lived with our father throughout the years of his active life. What money he made, she helped to save. His home was her home. His children were her children, reared by her. Although the Memorial Association worked hand in hand with the National Colored Women's League, the inescapable fact was that the public face of the Douglass family life, the one who controlled access to the artifacts, documents, and use, and the one who granted legitimacy to these memorial efforts, was his white widow. And she directed the public commemoration at Cedar Hill a place really that had been more hers than their mother's. Now, the children wanted to tell a similarly uplifting story about their father, but they wanted to place him in the context of their family. They had never lived at Cedar Hill as a family. Okay. Charles, and more famously Rosetta, in her memoir of her mother, then set about crafting the image of Frederick with Anna firmly at his side. Like him, she worked hard, taking in piecework in Lynn's shoe factories or laundry in New Bedford. Like him, she saved their pennies. Like him, she imbued her children with a sense of social responsibility. Now, they tried to wedge Anna, never much of the traditional type of activist, into the role of a recognizable abolitionist, noting her contributions to the Lynn Ladies Anti-Slavery Society and the Tales of the Underground Railroad. But they also emphasized abolition as a family endeavor. Anna joined the weekly rollings of newspapers on the day North Star was delivered. Anna insisted the boys go to work in the newspaper office to learn a trade, and Anna ensured that her husband presented an impeccable appearance on stage and on tour. If Douglass's life and work were to be commemorated, then this aspect must be included as a vital component. In other words, if Helen were ahead of the curve with historic preservation, the Douglass children were ahead of the curve in interpreting women's unpaid labor as a vital part of history. Helen probably did not maliciously exclude this aspect of the story. After all, most biographies and historic sites of the time focus on the work of singular men, the great man, with little reference to his family as part of the work. And, you know, half the time they didn't even mention the wife, or they mentioned the wife, he married so-and-so. Here is her pedigree. And moving on. But she was simply blind to the point of view that this narrative represented. Okay? And believed she was doing both good work as a professional widow responsible for the history of her husband and in preserving this aspect of Black history. And again, given the context of her time, she was. By the 1890s, the radical aims of Reconstruction had been completely abandoned, and the new hero of Black America, Booker T. Washington, asked his oppressed compatriots to quietly accept the reversal of promised equality. White America settled into understanding the Civil War that accommodated the Confederate lost cause, and when all the monuments started going up, and considered the conflict an unfortunate moment that led to dubious decisions to emancipate slaves. Even counter-narratives served white visions of themselves, with white abolitionists taking center stage, and the risks of African Americans transformed into tales of hidden fugitives. Frederick Douglass had survived as one of the few Black men who retained a prominent role in the telling of 19th century history. So by placing him within his family, the Douglass children used the fame of their father to refocus that history. First, by telling a family story, they alluded to the fragility of Black families in the face of slavery, economic deprivation, and violence that plagued them throughout the bulk of American history, including at that very moment, 10 miles in any direction from Cedar Hill. The Douglasses existed as an extended family unit because of the struggle of both Frederick and Anna, and in spite of the odds arrayed against them when they joined their futures together in 1838. Second, as a Black family collectively engaged in abolitionist work, the Douglasses represented a Black community that was also engaged in such work. Like their father, Charles, Lewis, and Rosetta had no problem with white people, or the fact that white people also participated in this movement. But they demanded the centrality of African Americans as active, even militant participants in the cataclysmic changes of the 19th century, and that those contributions be recognized. And indeed, the historiography on the abolitionist movement is only just now catching up to them. So for this narrative to work, Anna, she has to figure prominently in the role of Douglass's wife. The very fact of Helen and her commemoration activities at Cedar Hill in the District of Columbia obscured that. So, returning to the graves. and I had all of them, see, Helen, the children, at about the time this is going on. So returning to the graves, the asymmetry in the placement of the monuments and the different styles. You know, the first time I came here and I looked at it, I'm like, it didn't fit together. Okay. The monument of a family, the monuments to individuals, you know, even in this reference to DC on her slab, collectively depict the tensions that lay behind the history of this little spot right here. The monument that Charles and Lewis commissioned represents their family. And with both Anna and Frederick together in Rochester, the scene of their abolitionist ethos and Douglas's most unqualified heroic activism, and not too far from their home. The presence of their little sister Annie, whose death by meningitis they attributed to a broken heart over the execution of John Brown and Shields Green, who was part of that raid, but who was also worked with them, only reinforces that interpretation. The monument that Helen commissioned, not knowing that Anna was there or that monument was there, however, represents her vision of Frederick as an individual, the great man, who required no explanation, taking its place among the other great men of American history. Now, as for Helen, she only worried that she would be barred from being buried next to her husband's side. David Z. Morris assured her that she would not, but neither did she have a grave marker until the Frederick Douglass Memorial and Historical Association brought this one into the story into the 1970s. As the National Parks took over Cedar Hill in the National Library of Congress, the Douglass Papers, ensuring that Helen's vision of preserving her husband's legacy survived, the association placed this monument to its founder. And in doing so, they emphasized Frederick's life after his family had grown and after Anna had died, and recalled a site that symbolized the fruition of Frederick's earlier labor, or, you know, some instances, his failures and his retirement. Furthermore, Cedar Hill was a home that Frederick shared with Helen. It represented the place where Frederick pursued integration so far as to marry a white woman, an act interpreted as a rejection by many African Americans. But this is a more that is a more complicated Douglass. And here, with all the pieces put here, brings all that complexity into one place, recalling that other place, bringing it here to this place. Now, commemorative activities attempt to encapsulate the best parts of a person's life in order to pursue a particular end. Here in the gravesite, we can see these two strains of remembrance in Frederick Douglass's life. One depicts that fiery ex-slave defying all expectations and limitations, part of a black family, part of a black community, and a black movement. The other depicts the elder, well-off black statesman, advocating amalgamation, his right to associate with whomever he chose, however he chose, even into marriage. These two versions of Douglass, really two periods of a very long, eventful life, are represented by his two wives, Anna and Helen, the choice of his youth and the choice of his age. And they're both remembered alongside him. So thank you. I'd be happy to take questions, actually. Or not. I know it's hot. I'm up here sweating. Thought it was one big hot flash.
So, a little bit about your method. How long did it take you to write this book? And
I was asked that a little earlier.
what sort of, just the enormity of it is pretty amazing.
Well, thank you. Actually, I think I first got the idea, pardon me. I first got the idea when I was working at the Douglass Papers. I started working there in 2001, like 2 weeks before 9/11. And, excuse me. So I got it, but I didn't get it immediately when I started working there. In fact, if, and I'll be at the Seward stories, that I'll be talking a little bit about that tomorrow. But gradually, as I was doing the annotation, when I was working on the first volume of his correspondence, which was 1842 to 1852. And so this is early in his life, and especially in that abolitionist period, where he's really relying on the work of a lot of women, because they're the ones who are making this abolitionist movement happen. And I started getting interested in the women and the spaces that weren't necessarily covered in the biographies and all of these, and who they were and why they did what they did. And so I kind of conceived of this, to write a series of like a book that's chapters that are biographies of them. And my friend Bob, who is brilliant, and he has the Jeopardy credentials. He won Jeopardy. Oh, I'm kidding. Yeah, no, if you watch reruns of Jeopardy, you might see him come up occasionally. He's funny as hell, so that tells you no one. But he said, nobody's going to be interested in that. Write about the common thread. Douglas. Okay. And then I took a few, the road not traveled, and then I found my wife's not traveled. And then I started thinking about it again, and it came, it just wouldn't leave me alone. And then it's one of these things where, like, if I want to write a book about Douglas, and I want to write about a book about Douglas. I don't want to write a straight up biography because that would bore the hell out of me. I want to write about Douglas, but I want to write about the women around Douglas, and I want to write about him through those women. And I want to see how he looks through these women. And and the analogy I always use is the term negative space. I think about it's not negative space, it's feminine space. That feminine space around him, and there's a lot of feminine. He's surrounded by women, and his daughter buried up in Amy Post, and so when that was a couple of years after. So then I got a book contract for it. And my husband is really says, you need to get a contract for it. I'm like, a contract before I wrote the book? What's that? No, oh God, now I've got to write the thing, like in a period of time. And I'd say, when was that? I'd say that was about 2009, 2010, and it came out in 2017. So, long answer here. 2 years.
Cynthia, did you have a question?
I just did a talk the other night out in the town of Richmond in Honeyboy. I work with Historic Preservation of the Regional Landmark Society, and of course there's two pits homes on Main Street. And are there any descendants? Do you know of any? I don't know how many. She had at least 2 other sisters who went and graduated from college, one from Holyoke and one from Cornell.
Yeah, I don't think Eva didn't have any children, but Lorinda had children. And Lorinda married, I forget what his first name is, but his last name was Short. So she became Lorinda Short. And she had several children. She had one of the big, she had a big farm family. And then her brother Hiram moved out to Iowa. And he had a couple of kids. And I don't know what happened to them, but Douglas and Helen and Frederick were invited to one of the daughters' weddings. The invitation is in the papers at the Library of Congress. So they probably have descendants.
I'm curious about the legal status of Douglas's and Anna's children, since he was a slave and she was a free woman.
They would be free.
They would be free. Okay.
Yeah, the father. But I mean, again, so they're free. But if he gets taken back to slavery, or even you don't have to get. If they stayed in Baltimore, they're in Baltimore. But if you read the narrative or his autobiographies, I mean, his master moves him around a lot. So if the master decided, you're not gonna stay in Baltimore, you're going back to Talbot County.
Yeah.
That brings up their family.
Because Frederick eventually had to leave the country because of the Fugitive Slave Act, and I thought, well, would the children have been?
No, they were, I mean, their status was safe,
Oh.
but legally, but, I mean, you know, again, their life was precarious. And then, of course, I mean, 12 years a slave, there were kidnappers all, that'd be a common thing. So, so the fact that they could stay together, I mean, even though the free status was not nothing, but there was a whole lot of other things around to make sure that their family is safe. And that was part of the reason why the abolitionists he was with at the time, the Garrisonians, the American Anti-Slavery Society, they didn't believe you should pay for a person's freedom because they called it ransom. Because if you did, that was essentially recognizing the master's right to own a person. Jermaine Logan from Syracuse, his master said, well, I think it's his master, said that you can purchase your freedom, and he wanted his mother free, and he was willing to buy his mother. And the master said, you can buy your mother, but you have to buy yourself too. He said, I ain't doing it. I mean, that's hard. You know, his mother stayed in slavery because he wasn't going to buy himself. So Douglass was of that ilk, and when it came, you know, when it turned out that if he returned to America, the Alds were going to take him back, he was in a bind because there's the ideology side, I don't want to recognize this. But then there's the practicality. If I return, I'm going back to slavery, and what's going to happen to my family? And so the Richardsons raised the money to purchase his freedom, and they kind of presented it to him as like, it's a done deal, you don't have to engage in it. But he received a lot of criticism for it. It's like, yeah, white people, you make that choice, okay? And, but, you know, oddly, the one person who didn't criticize him was Garrison. But, so he did a good one there.
Any more questions? Well, I learned a lot tonight, I'll tell you. It was very illuminating. Thank you very much.